We are most honored to have as our annual A.J. Carlson Liberal Arts Lecturer, Professor Roosevelt Montás, Director of the Center for the Core Curriculum at Columbia College. My late friend and colleague, Jack Carlson, for whom this lecture is named, would be delighted to know that the director of what many in higher education consider the very model of a core curriculum within a great research university would be our speaker today. Since 1919, Columbia's core curriculum has sought to cultivate in students the capacity for reasoned discourse and searching deliberation about the ultimate ends of human life amidst the complexity and uncertainty of the human situation. Appropriately, Professor Montás earned his A.B., M.A., and Ph.D. in English from Columbia. As a scholar, Professor Montás specializes in American antebellum literature and culture, and as a teacher regularly offers courses in the moral and political thought of the West, requiring the reading of primary texts. Professor Montás's ability to employ the work of 19th century American literature, specifically the work of Ralph Waldo Emerson, to address the narrowness and tolerance of our current political discourse was in evidence at the 2017 annual conference of the Association of Core Texting Courses, where he delivered the keynote address to the scholar teachers from roughly 120 colleges and universities in the city of Dallas. This liberal arts conference, I can proudly say, was sponsored by Boston College. Professors Randy Tanglin, Dan Knuckles, and I shared the dais with Professor Montás that evening, and we were so inspired by his eloquent address that we began to discuss inviting him as our Carlson lecturer before he even left the dais, and that is the truth. As teachers and students in a community committed to fostering liberal education and a sense of civic responsibility among our students, Professor Montás will speak to us today on a subject close to the core of what we are, liberal education and democratic citizenship. On a personal note, I must add that I personally witnessed over the past 10 years Professor Montás' generous commitment of time, energy, and intellectual vision to liberal education in his service on the executive board of the Association of Core Text and Courses. It is my distinct privilege to introduce him.
Thank you so very much, Frank, for that really generous introduction and for your kind collegiality over the years. I've known Frank for a number of years precisely because we crossed paths at ACTC, and one of the pleasures of this occasion is to deepen that friendship. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank Randy Tanglin for her kind invitation here. Your work in the Johnson Center strikes me as very extraordinary. And I also wanted to thank Wendy Wilson for her really amazing efficiency in lining every detail of my visit so that I can be here smoothly and successfully today. And I want to thank all of you for being here. The act of participating in this conversation already tells me that much of what I want to say today is already in practice at a place like this. As you know, the title of my talk today is Liberal Education and Democratic Citizenship. Those two ideas are very closely connected, though perhaps not in obvious ways. And my hope for this talk is that it will help you see the connection clearly, and that you will use that perception to become more engaged in the process of your own ongoing education and in the exercise of democratic citizenship. My talk will come roughly in 3 parts, 4 parts. Liberal education, liberal knowledge, and knowledge there is in quotation marks for a reason that I will explain when I get to it. Some thoughts on human freedom, and lastly, some thoughts about where we are today. So let me begin first with this term liberal education, and what I want to do, this is the least scripted part of my talk, is just go over 3 quotes on liberal education that I think help us understand what that is all about. The first thing I want to say is that the term liberal has a contemporary political valence that is not the same meaning of the word as when it's used in liberal education. But one of the, we are in an intellectual, economic, cultural environment that is hostile to the project of liberal education, and some of that hostility comes from a misunderstanding of what the word liberal in liberal education means. The contrasted term of liberal education, the way it's used here, is technical education, vocational education, professional education, applied education. Those are the opposites of liberal education. Liberal education is liberated from any particular aim, the accomplishment of any particular specific goal. So the idea of liberal education goes back to ancient Greece, and particularly to Athens. Athens was a slave society, and also a democracy. Probably the earliest full-fledged democracy that we have good records of, possibly the earliest full-fledged complex democracy. It's always striking to me that the democracy, the first established democracy, is also a slave society. And it makes me think immediately if there's a relationship between slavery and democracy. And of course, our own democracy was also a slave democracy, which only kind of highlights the question. A liberal education was conceived as that education that was appropriate for the free members of the society, as opposed to slave education. So it was education for the free, as opposed to education for the slave. Now, Athenian democracy was a direct democracy. That is, the citizens of Athens participated directly in lawmaking. They voted on every law. It was a direct, not a representative democracy. They participated in juries. They made policy decisions. They fought in war. Think about the kind of education that an individual who is going to take part in the deliberations that will determine the laws, that will determine tax policy, that will determine foreign policy, that will determine questions of war and peace, that will determine the guilt or innocence of people on trial. What kind of education does a person like that need to have? That is the central question in the idea behind liberal education. So a few quotes to illustrate that. First one is from Aristotle's Politics. The best city-state will not confer citizenship on vulgar craftsmen, for it is impossible to engage in virtuous pursuits while living the life of a vulgar craftsman for a higher labor. It's impossible to engage in virtuous pursuits. Obviously, there's something repulsive about this statement. The idea that if you work for a living, you can't really engage in virtuous pursuits. But there is an important insight here, which is that the development, the participation in the affairs of the city, in citizenship, requires a certain cultivation that can only be possible when you pay attention to things other than making a living. If all of your energy is devoted to making a living, if all of your energy is devoted to meeting the basic needs of your material existence, then you do not have the bandwidth to engage in the sort of cultivation that is required of a citizen. So another quote from the Politics: it is evident then that there is a certain kind of education that children must be given not because it is useful, but because it is noble and suitable for a free person. A kind of education that is not pursued because it is necessary. It is not pursued because it will allow you to accomplish this or that, but it is pursued because it itself is a noble activity and an activity suitable for a free person. Another quote here is from Immanuel Kant: the science of the laws of nature is called physics, whereas the science of the laws of freedom is called ethics. I love this quote because free activity, free action, is not random, it's not chaotic, it's not erratic, it's not lawless, it's not anarchic, it's not chaotic. Free activity is actually rule governed, but it is governed by a particular set of guidelines that we impose on ourselves freely. And that capacity to impose laws on freedom is what ethics is. And there's something that we can grasp intuitively about this insight. When an ethical action only has moral worth when it is done freely. If you are compelled to do, think of an ethical action. There's an elderly person that needs help crossing the street, and even though you are running late for your appointment, you stop, you help this person cross the street. That action only has moral worth if it is done freely, if it is done willingly. If you are compelled, if you are forced, if you're required to do it, even if you do the same action, it has no moral worth. Moral worth is precisely a function of free deliberation. The laws of freedom are ethics. So, in the first place, liberal education is to teach you self-governance, to teach you how to be free. Self-governance not only in the collective or political sense, but also in the individual sense. I see that there are many students here, and one of the shocks of college life that I'm sure you have experienced and we who teach in college see every day is that one of the shocks of college life is the challenge of self-governance. Most people who fail at college fail not for intellectual reasons. They don't fail because the material presented to them is just too hard to learn, it's beyond their grasp, but they fail because of failures of self-governance. So this quote, "To be driven by appetite is slavery, and obedience to the law one has prescribed for oneself is liberty." This is the kind of liberty that is available to the autonomous individual. A kind of liberty from being driven by appetite alone, but being governed by rules that one sets for oneself. In a liberal education program, we try to expose students to how others have approached the challenge of self-governance, of freedom, and equip them thereby to organize their own way forward in life. So you can see right away that liberal education is going to be different than other kinds of education in college. In most disciplines, the subject to be learned is at the center, and the facts and skills to be learned are codified, transmitted, and tested in fairly straightforward ways. Not so in the liberal arts. In this field of study, the subject is secondary, and the student, the individual as a living, growing entity, is at the center. The inner transformation and developments that the subject matter promotes in the student is the liberal art education that we're after. The very act of learning in this way is an exercise of freedom. It cannot be compelled. It cannot be coerced. You can only be liberally educated through an affirmation of your own freedom, of your moral autonomy, of your dignity. Liberal education has to take the student as an end in itself and never as a vehicle to advance any other goal. So liberal education is not interested in you becoming a doctor or a lawyer or a literary critic, but in you becoming a fully realized and integrated human being. And being a fully realized and integrated human being is no simple matter. Allow me to highlight just one of the complexities involved in that project by remembering our old friend Sigmund Freud. In one of his introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, Freud pointed to 3 moments in human history where he says humanity was dealt what he called a blow to our self-love and naive narcissism. The first blow he called attention to was from Copernicus in his demonstration that the Earth was not the center of the solar system, but rather one of several bodies going around the sun. This meant that humans were not center stage in the universe. The universe was not built around us with us as the focal point. In fact, we seem to be located in a random corner with no particular significance to the whole scheme. You will remember that Galileo's demonstration of this fact got him into a lot of trouble. The second blow to our self-esteem as a species that Freud points out comes from Darwin, with his theory of evolution by natural selection. We are not separate and a special creation from the rest of the living world, but we emerged like other life forms through a natural process full of random accidents and fits and starts, and with no overarching design or aim. Contrary to what people often say about Darwin, that he showed that humans come from apes, he didn't. He showed not that humans come from apes, but that humans are apes. So this also is a difficult idea for us to swallow even today. The last of the three blows to our self-esteem as a species that Freud pointed to was his own postulation. You can always count on Freud, to be very modest. Was his own postulation of the existence and dominance of unconscious mental processes in determining who and what we are. Freud argued that not only are we not the center of the universe, and not only are we not biologically unique and special, but we are not even masters of our own minds, that thing about it that makes us feel different. We are not transparent to ourselves. We do not determine our thoughts, our desires, the forces that shape us. For Freud, our conscious experience is merely the tip of an immense iceberg of unconscious mental processes that really shape, unbeknownst to us, our motives, our values, our actions. This is a scary situation if I ever heard of one. Being a person turns out to be a rather complicated thing and involves a never-ending and humbling exploration of the mysteries of who we really are, what is really going on inside of us. We ourselves turn out to be uncharted territory. If nothing else, this revelation should warn us against the hubris of certainty, especially self-certainty. It calls to mind Socrates, who was deemed by the god to be the wisest man in Athens, not because he had great knowledge, but because he was the only one to realize that he, in fact, didn't really know anything. Each of his insights Freud highlights goes some ways towards, as it were, putting humanity in its place. And what is the place of humanity? Let's think about that for a second. We live in a historically unprecedented moment, not just in human history, but in planetary history. Never before in the history of this planet have there been 7.5 billion large animals walking around, large mammals, walking around, consuming, producing, tinkering. 7.5 billion and growing. And we're not just any kind of large mammal. We are rational. We are conscious. We have figured out how to manipulate our environment in astonishing ways. One could argue that this phase of human history, the one in which we live, kicks into gear with the scientific and philosophical breakthroughs of the European Enlightenment. These have given us tremendous mastery over our environment. But this powerful, rational apparatus also stripped nature of a certain mystery, bleached out our sense of reverence before the whole, despiritualized our existence, and encouraged a non-relational view of nature. This non-relational view of nature has led to the illusion that we can manipulate our environment at will and exploit the planet without consequences. As a result, we are now living in a period of human-caused mass extinction of species, and we function in an economic order that threatens planetary catastrophe. But back to my point that liberal education is education for freedom. It's not surprising that while the idea of liberal education goes back to antiquity, its modern incarnation is almost uniquely American. In the United States, as you well know, almost all colleges have a set of general education requirements, mainly in the humanities, that every student must take regardless of his or her major. In most places, the general education requirement is organized around a set of distribution requirements that emphasize broad areas of learning or specific learning goals. In most cases, these general education requirements fall far short of delivering a true liberal arts education. But that perhaps can be the subject of a future conversation. Today, In a society where chattel slavery is no longer exists, the essence of liberal education continues to be the development of individuals as free agents rather than as laborers, workers, or even scholars. In this way, liberal education represents a special mission within the university. A good part of the university must be specialized, must be about creating economically productive individuals who can earn a living. But that's not the soul of the university. That is not what is unique and sacred about the function of the university in society. The university must be precisely a place where instrumental knowledge can be put aside to create a space for liberal knowledge. Liberal knowledge. Why knowledge in quotation marks? Because of this quote, the most important thing is to find out what is the most important thing. The kind of knowledge that liberal arts education concerns itself is this kind of knowledge. The kind of knowledge that liberal education encourages is of a different sort than the knowledge that dominates in the rest of the university. Generally speaking, the university is a place where the scientific paradigm of knowledge predominates. Scientific knowledge progresses cumulatively. It builds on discoveries of the past and adds new ones on top of those. We understand infectious disease and electromagnetic radiation and climate change much better today than we did 50 years ago. But the liberal arts don't quite progress in this way. We don't understand the experience of grief, or how to live with the consciousness of death, or the meaning of love and nobility any better today than we did 100 years ago. The latest war novel is not an improvement on the Iliad. The same goes for art. Warhol and Rothko are not superior to Michelangelo and Renoir. Art does not get better as time goes on. We can contrast scientific versus liberal knowledge along several axes, and here's just a list that I just threw together. Scientific knowledge is cumulative versus liberal knowledge, which is iterative, that is, changes in internal proportions rather than moving linearly. Scientific knowledge is servile, that is, it is in the interest of a particular goal, it is instrumental, as opposed to liberal. The value of scientific knowledge is instrumental, it's about what it allows you to accomplish. The value of liberal knowledge is intrinsic. It is contained within itself and it is not with reference to what it can accomplish. Scientific knowledge is empirical and liberal knowledge is intuitive. Scientific knowledge might be described as the speculative reason that Plato shared with God, as opposed to the pragmatic reason that Ulysses shared with the foxes. That's from Reinhold Niebuhr writing about Alfred North Whitehead. Another way of framing this difference is using terms that the ancient Greek used, techne and phronesis. And let me say a few words about those two terms. Aristotle defined phronesis as practical wisdom or prudence. I like the contemporary word judgment. Phronesis, or judgment, prudence, is what you call upon to engage in questions that cannot be resolved by calculation. Issues that are embedded in human value systems that cannot be reduced to binary elements. Do I send Ted Cruz back to the Senate, or do I replace him with Beto O'Rourke, for instance? Your judgment on that question will no doubt be informed by data. The record of each man, the ideas that they advocate, etc. But these data points do not resolve the issue. Values, trust, vision, and intangible qualities that are irreducible to data will have to guide your decision. So living our ordinary lives, we see that technical knowledge does not lend itself to resolving some of the problems that most matter to us. Technical knowledge is appropriate for what is calculable, for what one might call determinate objects. That is, objects that exist discretely in a circumscribed field and are stable in such a way that they can be described precisely. In most cases, knowledge about such determinate objects can be ultimately expressed in mathematical form. But there are a great many things, human things, that are resistant to this kind of determinate understanding. When the questions before us concern things like justice, the good, the beautiful, the very questions that ground our existence, then technical knowledge is of limited use. To situate ourselves before the basic dilemmas of human existence, to navigate our inner worlds, we have to call on capacities and intuitions that have as much to do with intellect as they do with character. Precisely, we have to call on those capacities that qualify us as free and moral agents irreducible to calculation. So liberal learning integrates knowing, doing, and being. The question of ultimates is always in view. What really matters? What kind of life is truly worth living? What is worth striving for? What is worth wanting? What kind of thing is the human good? Liberal knowledge is not divorced from how one lives in the world, from action that grows out of the values and insights that one gains. And it implies constant examination of the deep sources of our motivation and of our desires. So liberal knowledge, phronesis, practical wisdom, prudence, judgment, is ground that is always shifting, always unfolding in ways that we can't anticipate, a field where doubt and intuition are as important as proof and certainty. Look at this interesting exchange. Probably too small for you to read, so I'll read it aloud. This is Socrates talking to Euthyphro, who was a religious authority. Socrates says, what are the subjects of difference that cause hatred and anger? Let us look at it this way. If you and I were to differ about numbers as to which is the greater, would this difference make us enemies and angry with each other? Or would we proceed to count and soon resolve our difference about this? We would certainly do so, says Euthyphro. Socrates, again, if we differed about the larger and the smaller, would we turn to measurement and soon cease to differ? That is so. And about the heavier and the lighter, we would resort to weighing and be reconciled. Of course. What subject of difference would make us angry and hostile to each other if we were unable to come to a decision? Perhaps you do not have an answer ready, but examine, as I tell you, whether these subjects are the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the ugly, the good and the bad. Are these not the subjects of difference about which, when we are unable to come to a satisfactory decision, you and I and other men become hostile to each other whenever we do? Whereas we can attain determinate knowledge of things we can measure and quantify, what Socrates called questions of the larger and the smaller, the heavier and the lighter. When we turn to matters of the soul, the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the ugly, the good and the bad, the soul's capacity for self-motion, its freedom, makes these subjects resistant to the kind of determinate knowledge available to empirical investigation. So, another way to describe the liberal arts is to say that they deal with questions of the soul. And by soul, I mean an entity that is conscious of itself, that is conscious of itself as free and self-determining. We don't need to get into the question of whether we're actually free. Suffice it to say that the soul experiences itself as free. That is, that we, each of us, experiences him or herself as a free agent. But I do need to stress the following point. The fact that the field with which the liberal arts concern themselves is not the proper object of empirical study does not mean that one doesn't learn anything in the liberal arts. But there is a distinct way in which you learn something liberally. To learn something liberally means that you take an interest in the process of learning itself, and that you come to understand the thing learned in a larger context. You understand not only what is being learned, but also why it is being learned, not only how something works, but what it means for it to work the way that it does. One of the characteristics of liberal learning is that the learning is not added on top of your previous stock of knowledge. When you learn something liberally, it rearranges everything else that you know. You don't just end up with more knowledge, but with a different configuration of knowledge. In other words, liberal learning alters the internal proportions of your soul. Human freedom. In the politics, Aristotle makes another very relevant point. A complete community, he says, comes to be for the sake of living, but it remains in existence for the sake of living well. Aristotle's insight here is quite crucial. While survival and sustenance are at bottom the reason why we live together, any well-organized society will overcome the threat of extinction quite quickly. Once the necessaries of survival are assured, as they are for all of us, the questions of living shift fundamentally, and we begin to concern ourselves not just with survival, but with existence. How do we live well? What kind of knowledge best guides life? What do we do now that only a small amount of our physical and mental energy needs to be devoted to surviving? It's striking to me that so much of our education, by which I mean the non-liberal part of our education, educates as if our main goal in life were to earn sustenance. It's as if we're caught in evolutionary infancy, where we cannot truly grasp or accept that meeting the basic requirements of living need no longer be our central preoccupation. So we organize our education and much of our life activity as if we still lived in the savannah with the threat of starvation always looming. Our fear of not having enough drives us to hoard, accumulate, and to enslave our life to what is literally a never-ending quest for more goods and more security. This hunger runs very deep in our psyche, and while we have tamed it with laws and the threat of punishments, it's still a central force in the specific ways in which we organize our society, our politics, our economy. Hobbes understood this clearly and noted it in his Leviathan. In the first place, I put for a general inclination of mankind a perpetual and restless desire for power after power that ceaseth not till death. Hobbes always with his cheerful aphorisms. Let me say explicitly what is perhaps obvious, that this perpetual and restless desire for power after power, which is as human and as natural as a parent's love for a child, is one of the main reasons why freedom is so complicated. Our freedom, our moral autonomy, our capacity to reflect and direct our actions lives in us alongside this deep and restless hunger for power. How do we negotiate our moral freedom with our impulse to dominate? How do we reconcile our natural empathy and benevolence with our suspicion and our fear? How do we manage the tangled economy of psychic forces that all flesh is heir to? These are some of the problems of human freedom. As Hume, Freud, Nietzsche, and others have pointed out, even though we are rational creatures, we are fundamentally not rational. Our reason is always the servant of deeper forces of desire. And while most formal education deals with training our reason, liberal education deals with bringing order into the economy of our desires, with refining our sensibilities, with expanding our moral imagination. But as I said, most of our education, with its emphasis on economic rewards, educates as if our main goal in life is to earn sustenance. It is caught in our desire for domination, accumulation, and security. Our situation in this regard is analogous to our situation in regard to food. We are evolutionarily programmed to want to eat a lot more than we need, on the presumption that food will not always be available. This works both psychologically and physiologically. Psychologically, our desire for food far exceeds our need for food. Physiologically, our bodies have evolved mechanisms to hold on to every calorie by converting it to fat and storing it all around our bodies. Our drive to eat evolved to keep us going through periods of plenty and through periods of famine. So now, when food is always available, we are facing an epidemic of obesity. Our bodies and our appetites are not evolved to handle permanent abundance of food. In order to stay healthy, we have to make a conscious effort, a sometimes very difficult and painful effort, not to give our bodies the high sugar, high fat, delicious food it's always asking for. This is something we all have to live with, and we can understand at the individual level, but something similar is happening at the collective level. The bulk of our education is focused on preparing us for jobs rather than preparing us to find ways of living sustainably. We should be thinking not about what kind of job we will have, but about what kind of life we will live. Our task should be to organize our lives in such a way that our life activity itself produces our means of sustenance. We should be in the business of fashioning a life and a society in which we don't have to sell some portion of our humanity every day for the privilege of living on the weekends. To use a biblical phrase, we should be in the business of creating a life and a society where we don't have to sell our birthright for a mess of pottage. This is the category of issue to which liberal arts education addresses itself. When our approach to education is non-liberal, we keep our students' attention riveted to the job market, riveted to the acquisition of skills, to earning potentials. It's not that these things aren't important. Like food, they are very important. But as with food, our appetite exceeds our wisdom. The fact that food matters a lot does not mean that we should eat as much as possible, or that we should not restrain our appetite. We must restrain our appetite, or we will kill ourselves. Something like this is happening at the societal level. Although we can't change society in one fell swoop, the university's mission must include looking beyond the materialist ethos of our time and educating ourselves to be free rather than enslaved to our desires for power, wealth, and security. A liberal education confronts us with the fundamental questions of human existence. And this invitation to grapple with the big questions is important because the big questions come with the territory of being free. Freedom, is great, but it brings its own problems. We are unique in the world in that we don't just follow physical laws or even our instincts. We can inhabit the world and interact with it in a way that is free, in a way that is indeterminate and indeterminable. Rocks, tables, clouds are not in the world in the same way that we are. We are in the world in the same way that they are, but we are also in the world in a different way that is peculiar to us. We are aware of ourselves. Even beyond that, we are aware of ourselves being aware. It is this doubling of awareness upon itself that makes us a different sort of thing than rocks, tables, clouds, and as far as we can tell, even other animals. We are ourselves by virtue of our own awareness of being ourselves. We are what we are aware of being. This self-referential, self-constituting ontological condition means that we are not a determinate thing, like a rock or a table. We do not have a determinate soul. We have an indeterminate, self-actualizing soul. We have this quality, freedom. It is this quality that the liberal arts aim at and are engaged with. I hope I'm not losing too many of you, so let me call on multimedia to help illustrate the condition of freedom and indeterminacy that I am describing. Here is a video of a double pendulum. A double pendulum that is a pendulum that is swinging from a second pendulum. So here he's setting it up. That's just a pendulum. Swing, 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 obeying basic laws of motion, momentum, gravity, air resistance. Now he's going to untie that middle joint there, releasing a second arm that is itself a pendulum, and that is going to swing from a swinging pendulum. Well, here he has it just as a long pendulum. So that continues the single pendulum motion. Now he's going to stop it, release that hold there so that it will be two truly independently swinging pendulum. See if you can detect a pattern in the swinging of the pendulum. You can't detect the pattern, can you? That's because there isn't one. The two pendulum scenario is in fact a chaotic system. The system's movements, though strictly determined by simple laws of physics, this thing I want to emphasize, the movements of the pendulums are strictly determined by very simple laws of physics. But when you string them together like that, they are in fact unpredictable and unascertainable. It's impossible for us to predict from the initial conditions how the double pendulum is going to move. The double pendulum, in other words, undergoes chaotic motion. But complex systems can get even more indeterminate. The double pendulum is what is called a first-order chaotic system. There is also what's called a second-order chaotic system. This is when the system reacts to predictions about it, so that understanding any part of the system that functions predictably immediately changes it and the system itself. The stock market is like this. If we could predict what the stock market was going to do, that knowledge, the stock market would adapt to that knowledge and invalidate the prediction. Self-knowledge is also indeterminate in the second-order way. Our self-understanding changes us. In the act of knowing ourselves, we become something else. The object that we know is changed by our knowing it. So we live as fundamentally, radically indeterminate beings. That is, as free beings. So let me talk a little bit about today. In the United States, liberal education as we know it today took shape in the early 20th century with Columbia's core curriculum, which, as Frank said, started in 1919, leading the way. In 1945, a committee of faculty at Harvard, always following Columbia, published a book called General Education in a Free Society, which came to be known as the Red Book because of its original red cover. The book quickly became the manual for American liberal education. The book's title, General Education in a Free Society, is significant. And the date 1945, because what the author saw in 1945 was a general democratization of society, with colleges and political life beginning to be penetrated by non-elites. So they wondered with some trepidation what kind of general education would be appropriate for the mass of people poised to enter political life. They understood that, as a friend of mine likes to put it, the problem with democracy is that the people rule. Whereas in ancient Athens, the majority of people were not involved in governing, and only those who were required a liberal education, our American democracy, founded by we the people, requires that everyone be equipped with the virtues necessary for self-government, the virtues necessary for citizenship. Amidst the current trends towards seeing education primarily as job preparation, we have to remember that without liberal education, we simply cannot have democracy. Without liberal education, we can't sustain a free society. So the task of liberal education is more urgent today than ever before, because we are living in a period of democratic crisis in our republic. We are, as well as an unprecedented moment in human history. I'm not from around here, so I'm not going to get into the politics. But I do want to point out that never before has a species approached technical mastery of the basic molecular mechanisms of life. And never before has a species been able to transfer into a machine its entire knowledge base. We know that whenever in history there has been a leap in communications technology, profound social and cognitive revolutions follow. We know that nothing like the revolution in communication and connectivity that has swept over us in the last 2 decades has ever happened before. Consider, for instance, some of the developments in the 10-year period between 2000 and 2010. A draft of the human genome was completed in 2000. Free video conferencing came along in the form of Skype in 2003. Facebook emerged in 2004, Twitter in 2006, the mobile internet in 2005, in 2007 the iPhone with the App Store in 2008, and mobile broadband 4G that is widespread by 2010. That is mobile internet, full-blown mobile internet by 2010. And this pace of technological innovation seems to be accelerating. Siri, Alexa, Google Assistant, Snapchat, VR goggles, and AR glasses are all transforming how we live and underlining the fact that we've crossed over into a new phase of human existence. There are places in the world where people don't have running water but have smartphones. That is, handheld computers more powerful than anything that the President of the United States had during the entire Cold War. There is no question that we are living in a Gutenberg moment. These are dizzying developments that are altering at a very basic level how we live, how we relate, and how we understand ourselves. We are at an inflection point, having entered an unprecedented period of deep transformation. The practice of liberal education can contribute, should contribute, must contribute to making sense of these developments. But amidst all these changes, some things still remain the same. Aristotle pointed out that we are by nature political animals, creatures of the polis, or the city, creatures who live, work, and find their life's meaning in association with others. To educate is to nurture an individual into a collaborative community, into a body politic. The process of education ultimately is the process of citizenship making, citizen making. It is the process of rearing an individual into a particular community. Sometimes I find etymology, the study of the origin of words, amazingly revealing. Take, for instance, the word idiot. It comes from the Greek idios, which means that which pertains to one's self, as in the English word idiom or idiosyncratic. Idios denotes a person who is only concerned with private matters, a person who is ignorant of the public world. Liberal education is a kind of education that can truly be described as the cure for idiocy. That is, an education that cultivates the capacity to reflect on what is common to humans, on what is shared. Another way of describing what is common, or shared, or public, is what is political. A liberal education prepares one to enter the public world, prepares one to leave the state of idiocy and become a political being. This practice of the liberal arts can be dangerous, for sure. Many of you remember Socrates' fate in the courts. He was condemned to death for corrupting the youth of Athens. You'll remember, as he tells in the Apology, that Socrates liked to go around asking the young people, "Are you not ashamed of your eagerness to possess as much wealth, reputation, and honor as possible, while you do not care for nor give thoughts to wisdom or truth, or the best possible state of your soul?" I'm inclined to think that we need to go around asking the same questions of ourselves and of our peers. Let me end with this. Sometimes people say that what characterizes liberal learning is exactly its uselessness. That the point of liberal learning is that it is not pursued as a means to obtain something else, but that it is simply sought for its own sake. I see the point, but I disagree with that way of looking at it. A liberal education is extremely useful, and we pursue it for the highest of human ends. To put it simply, a liberal education is there to help you find your way. And this is your basic task in life, to find your way. There is, in the final analysis, nothing else to do in your life but to find your way. Not someone else's way. Not the way of your role models or of your parents. Not the way of success, but your way. A liberal education does not tell you what your way is, but equips you for a kind of self-exploration and investigation of the world around you that can lead to genuine living, to a life of honesty and clarity. That life might include making a lot of money, but it might not. The point of liberal education is not to make you rich. That life might include having an impact on many lives around you, but it might not. The point of liberal education is not to make you a philanthropist. That life might include many friends, or it might not. The point isn't to turn you into a social butterfly. But a liberally educated life will be richer than otherwise. It will be more true. It will be more awake. It will be more alive and creative. And it will be more free. To modify a quote from Henry David Thoreau, if a liberal education does one thing, it is to ensure that when you come to die, you don't then discover that you have not lived.